America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at Billionaire at the Barricades by Laura Ingrahan. And this book was published in 2017, same year as the last book I reviewed, which was The Conscience of a Conservative by Jeff Flake. So that was just barely into the Trump administration. This one as well, just barely into the Trump administration. Both these books, I think, were published toward the end of the year because they both had some things to say about Trump's leadership in the short time that he had been in office once the book went to press. This one possibly even later because she talks about a number of things that Trump had done. So this book I wanted to read to sort of counter some of Jeff Flake's arguments. Jeff Flake had said that essentially nationalism and populism were not like fundamental parts of conservatism, and that the conservatives had gone astray by embracing populism and nationalism. They had sort of sold out their principles by embracing these political movements of nationalism and populism. I don't think that's accurate, and I'm going to be looking at this book and some other stuff as well to counter that point. This book talks more about the populist idea than the nationalist idea. Laura Ingrahan is one of my favorite writers and media personalities. She's close friends with Pat Buchanan, and he is on her show pretty often. She has a show on Fox. At one point, she had a radio show. I don't know if she still does or not. I don't listen to talk radio really, but for a long time, she was on talk radio, and she really takes the right, I think, avenue to conservatism. I don't believe she uses the phrase paleo-conservative in here. She uses more like the phrase populist conservative or conservative populist. She binds the notions of conservatism and populism together, and this book is really like a lot of books that you get from people who are media personalities. It's not like a philosophy. This isn't a book of political philosophy. It's more like journalism. It's kind of like journalism combined with like a research paper. It's just a long exposition of a series of events with a lot of details about, who said what, quotes from different people, and particulars about all of the various things that happened along the way. And so she's kind of telling the story of populism in the Republican Party to an extent. She starts with kind of sequentially speaking, she starts with Barry Goldwater, talks a little bit about Goldwater as a populist. I'm going to not get into that really. She doesn't say an awful lot about that, and I don't know as though her case is particularly that strong. She talks about a few like Nixon and Spiro Agnew, his vice president, having some populist, ideas to them. And then she gets to Reagan. She spends a little bit more time talking about Reagan. And, she just kind of goes, it's really about the presidents and what walks through the various campaigns, the campaign promises, the way the different presidents served in office, and gets right up to Donald Trump. She spends a lot of time talking about the Trump campaign, and then spends a little bit of time talking about what Trump has done in office by the time that the book is written. So there's a few parts. I think I've got, let's see. Looks like 6 parts in here that I want to read out loud. And one of them is going to be a little bit about the Trump campaign, although that's a pretty short section. I'm not going to talk much about that. I really want to talk more about like the Reagan era and a little bit about Bush Sr. and Clinton and the campaigns that were happening at that time. And she talks a little bit about Pat Buchanan, who ran some sort of like insurgent campaigns trying to represent what she describes as the populist wing of the Republican Party against the establishment. That's sort of the way she sets it up, is there's the establishment Republicans, And then there's the populist. There are the populist Republicans. She sets these two like in opposition to one another. Whereas, I tend to think about the split as between the paleo-conservatives and the neoconservatives. And then, of course, you've got the broad array of conservatives that don't identify as either neo or paleo, or maybe sometimes will reject the label of neo since that's definitely gone out of fashion, but just sort of absorb maybe a middle stance between the two and a little bit of the ideas of both. And I think when the neoconservatives are more in power than the vast bulk of self-identified conservatives who aren't actually like spending their time reading political theory or, having, a deep understanding of political issues, will just kind of gravitate to the neo side of the equation because that's who is setting the tone. And then when the paleos or the populists are more in power, then the bulk of conservatives kind of start gravitating to those ideas because that's what's being put forward as like the official doctrine of conservatism or of the Republican Party. So I'm much more aligned with Laura Ingraham's position on these issues than I am with Jeff Flake's. Jeff Flake probably a little closer to, I guess it's pretty fair to say Jeff Flake's like establishment. He comes from before he was he was a congressman, a representative, and then he was a senator. And before that, he was from a think tank. He came from a think tank. And in the think tanks, you don't really have to appeal all that much to ordinary people, the masses, if you will. You still have to get elected. He was a congressman and a senator. He still had to run campaigns and get elected, but it's not really, you just being involved in the whole elite think tank conservative world just goes a long way toward getting the donations and getting somebody elected. So it's not necessarily the case that going through the process of an election and of a primary is necessarily, means that an elected representative or a senator or anyone else is like a man of the people. It's very often the case that these guys who are in office at these high levels are in fact establishment Republicans, whereas Laura Ingraham has never held office. She doesn't come from think tanks. She comes from talk radio where, ratings rule, and she has to always be, getting listeners. And so for that reason, I think talk radio conservatism tends more toward the populist side. You've got to get people regularly listening to your show. You can't do that just by talking down at them. You have to understand what people's concerns are. And so, I think that the talk radio conservatives tend to be more plugged in to what the rank and file believes. And as a result of that, oftentimes tends to be more populist in their outlook. So like in all of my episodes, there's parts I agree with, parts I don't, and kind of in opposite to the last one, I agreed with almost everything she said in here. And actually, I can't think off the top of my head of really anything she said that I didn't agree with. Possibly she's a little bit maybe more skeptical of libertarianism than I am. I think she grows frustrated with libertarianism, but I can empathize. I think some of the worst there's parts of libertarianism that get under my skin as well, and I think the same parts get under her skin. But most of the book, as I read it, I thought, yeah, that sounds about correct. So I'm going to read a few sections and have some comments about what I read. Let me jump in and start reading a section from, this is chapter 1, fairly early along, when she just kind of talks about populism and what it is. So she says, quote, Americans are used to left versus right political disagreements, like judicial activism versus judicial restraint, union versus non-union. Populists understand that there's a top and a bottom too. The establishment, composed of powerful elites on both the left and the right, does not trust individuals to make decisions for themselves. Instead, they believe Washington experts and bureaucrats must fill the void. Populists believe individuals should have more control over their own lives. Presidential candidates invoke the populist style because it connects with working people. Except for Reagan, all modern presidents of both parties campaigned as populists, but governed as globalists. Populism isn't new. It arose in the 1890s when the so-called robber barons, businessmen who gained wealth and influence through unethical business practices, amassed power that hurt workers. Populists revolted and formed a short-lived National People's Party. Its platform was essentially left-wing. It was pro-labor and anti-capitalist, and was especially hostile to banks and railroads. That party effectively merged with the Democrats in 1896 and ultimately disappeared in 1908. But the populist style, with its emphasis on the common-sense wisdom of the working class, remained a potent force the Democrats and Republicans both co-opted for years to come. Because populism is not an ideology, it often appears with a descriptor like progressive populism or conservative populism. On the left side of the political spectrum, progressive populism wraps big government schemes in the guise of populism. Bill Clinton's Arkansas everyman populist style ultimately gave way to disastrous global trade deals. Obama's hope and change morphed into a historic growth in government power. In 2016, establishment media tried to portray Bernie Sanders as a left-wing populist. In reality, of course, Sanders was little more than a socialist retread. Nevertheless, he ran an impressive campaign, one that managed to draw massive crowds of over 20,000. It's amazing what promising young kids' free college tuition can do. On the surface, Sanders seemed to agree with Donald Trump's populist opposition to bad trade deals, foreign interventionism, and Wall Street corruption. But on domestic issues, Sanders' proposals were the same old, failed government power grabs and massive tax gambits that are antithetical to economic freedom. As President Reagan put it, as government expands, liberty contracts. Instead of returning power to the people, Sanders' plans would have squelched workers' wealth and freedom. Still, the fact that a man of Sanders' age could be a thorn in Hillary Clinton's side was just as much a compliment to him as a sign that Clinton's candidacy was deeply flawed. By contrast, conservatism and populism overlap in their opposition to big things, big government, big international organizations, big media, big business cronyism. These distant, uncaring entities rob people of decision-making and ignore their interests. Pat Buchanan and Donald Trump summarized conservative populism best when each vowed to put America first. Conservative populists tend to support a policy of economic nationalism, people-centered economic policies that put the nation and its workers first. They oppose a massive national debt because it weakens America and makes its citizens beholden to lenders. They also believe high taxes are bad because they sap workers' wages and economic freedom. Similarly, they are against huge trade deals and international organizations like the World Trade Organization because they take power out of the hands of voters and give it to a faraway and often hostile global elite. In foreign affairs, conservative populists oppose broad military interventionism and believe military force should be used when American interests are threatened. Populists' critics like to toss around the term isolationism to dismiss populist foreign policy, but that doesn't fit any populist I've ever known. Throughout the Cold War, populists were among the strongest voices opposing Soviet communism. At the same time, they believe squandering the nation's wealth and blood on unwinnable wars and nation-building is unwise. Instead, they support a pragmatic foreign policy based on achieving peace through strength, by maintaining a strong military and using it prudently. If all this sounds familiar, that's because conservative populist Ronald Reagan remade American politics with his two landslide presidential victories in 1980 and 1984. The populist movement that propelled Reagan into office came roaring back in 2016 to produce the most stunning political victory in American history. End quote. So, Yeah, she's just sort of a rundown of populism. She says there's kind of two types of populism. She says populism is not an ideology, so it often appears with a descriptor like progressive populism or conservative populism. Essentially, she defines populism as understanding that there's a top and bottom, that there's an establishment that believes that individuals don't have the capability of making their own decisions, and they need to be managed by experts in Washington and bureaucrats, whereas populists believe that individuals should have more control over their own lives. That's obviously a sort of conservative vision of populism. But when you say power to the people, what the conservative means is power to the person, power to each person. Let each person make their decisions about how they're going to live their life. But it also means power to the people in the sense of, take some of the authority away from like the establishment, the powerful elites who are running society, and restore that power to the masses. The question, of course, becomes like how do the masses have power if there's some entity that steps up to claim to represent the masses, like the government is of the people, for the people, but the government stepping up and claiming to represent the will of the people. I mean, what is government but the individuals that work in the government and that manage the government? And it's very easy to just, not be able to escape the elites so long as there are people who are essentially elites who are claiming to speak for or represent the people. So it has to be, in order for it to be authentic, there has to be power to the individual person, power to the individual in order to really make such a thing happen, I think. And I think that's kind of the conservative way of approaching that. And she criticizes Sanders, and she criticizes progressive populism as not really being effective. And, she talks about military. She says conservative populists oppose broad military interventionism. They oppose huge international organizations like the World Trade Organization. And she uses the word isolationist as sort of a critic. She says populism's critics like to toss around the term isolationism to dismiss populist foreign policy. Again, this harkens to sort of what I like to think of as the big three components of paleoconservatism as defined by Buchanan, especially as defined by Buchanan in the book that I reviewed, Day of Reckoning, way back in the very early days of the podcast, which were, I like to use the terms. Some people don't. Some people think they're misnomers, but isolationism, protectionism, and nativism. All three of those are used as slurs. I'm not afraid to say that I think we should be more isolationist than we are. Maybe not purely isolationist in the sense that we don't trade with anybody, we don't have any kind of international relationships with anybody, but we don't need to be in all of these international organizations. They don't necessarily benefit us. Sometimes it seems like they're just constraints upon what we can do, and to not be involved militarily, to have this global military footprint, to have bases all over the world, to feel the need to get involved in every single military or quasi-military event that happens on the surface of the earth. We must be involved in that in somehow. That's kind of the opposite. So the paleoconservative position is more like non-interventionism or isolationism. Like me, I don't feel like the term isolationist is like a slur, but that's just me. And then there's also the protectionism and the nativism, and she doesn't really talk about that in that part, but we'll get to that a little bit here and there further on in the book. And she says that the populist believes in having a strong military, but using it prudently, using it judiciously, so peace through strength. And then she says this sounds like Reagan. That's because Reagan was a conservative populist. And she talks a little bit about Reagan's campaigns, and she talks about how he ran the country when he was president, and what sort of things made him populist. She doesn't spend a tremendous amount of time on Reagan. Ultimately, this book spends the most time talking about Donald Trump. It's called Billionaire at the Barricades. Donald Trump is the billionaire at the barricades. So she talks most about Trump, but she does talk about all of these other figures as well in the lead up to Trump, trying to establish the existence of an ongoing populist strain within conservatism, that it's not a foreign element of conservative doctrine. So when she talks a little bit about Reagan, this part here, she's talking about Reagan's victory in 1984 when he beat Walter Mondale, and it was a real total landslide. People were very happy in 1984 with Reagan's first term, and so they elected him by a landslide to serve a second term. And so she says this about Reagan. She says, quote, "A big part of the story of the last 30 years is that different people followed Reagan for different reasons. Various right-of-center factions each claim him as a shining textbook example of their beliefs, borne out on the presidential stage. Reagan was a genius who combined different categories when he communicated. That's why he won 49 states in 1984. For every libertarian quote from Reagan, you can find a populist quote from Reagan. So it's easy to see why each group now amplifies their favorite Reagan themes and mutes the others. The core of Reaganism was this: returning power to the people by disempowering behemoth bureaucratic institutions yields the greatest freedom for all." He believed in the individual over the state. Drop in at any point along the Reagan timeline, even during his days as a Democrat, and you will hear him declaring his belief that power should reside with the citizens, not government. Today, we refer to this idea as Reaganism, but he would have hated that term. This, after all, was the man who had a plaque on his Oval Office desk that read, "There is no limit to what a man can do or where he can go if he doesn't care who gets the credit." But more than that, he knew that lasting political movements must be built around principles, not personalities. Reagan liked to say, "Don't trust me, trust yourselves." This was his consistent view that throughout his political life, and it helped pave the path for the populist movement of the present. It's easy to see why historians have called him a true American populist. Today, we remember Ronald Reagan in almost mythic terms as a towering figure whose ascendancy and landslide presidential victories were inevitable, even predictable. Yet many of those who claim to have been with Reagan all along weren't, not by a long shot. Libertarians, for example, attacked Reagan's economic populism for decades. Until recently, I did not appreciate how many writers who call themselves conservatives are actually libertarians. But as we saw during the 2016 election cycle, the libertarian numbers in the GOP are just not that significant, and the same was true under Reagan. Here is what the leading libertarian think tank, the Cato Institute, wrote about Reagan's economic policies in a 1988 policy paper. "If President Reagan has a devotion to free trade, it surely must be blind because he has been off the mark most of the time. Their beef? Reagan had the audacity to protect American jobs and companies by slapping hefty tariffs on some foreign goods like Japanese electronics, a 100% tariff, and motorcycles, 45% tariff, a move meant to help Harley-Davidson. Libertarians like to say that we can't criticize how China manipulates markets if our own government occasionally interferes with a pure market system. Absurd. For one, that's like saying we could not criticize the Soviet Union for human rights abuses, because we occasionally backed allies with less than pristine human rights records. And second, whatever level of interference we impose upon markets, it's infinitesimally small, and in no way comparable to China, for the simple reason that theirs is not a market economy at all. For added anti-Gipper libertarian gusto, Cato likened Reagan to the man who presided over the Great Depression and dubbed him the most protectionist president since Herbert Hoover. It's one of the oldest and lamest tricks in the book of the anti-populists. Impugn anyone who doesn't worship trade agreements and tariff-free commerce as a protectionist, isolationist, or nativist. All throughout the 2016 election, Trump and any of us who supported him were showered with the ists. Should Reagan have had America unilaterally disarm economically against countries that subsidized their industries and manipulated their currency? Since when is it bad to protect our nation and its workers? Reagan wasn't picking winners and losers willy-nilly in the marketplace. He was giving American industries a fighting chance to compete against nations who rigged the rules in their favor. Personally, I've never found libertarianism to be an interesting worldview. Politics take place in the real world with real people, not in the dusty pages of an Ayn Rand novel. But libertarians weren't the only ones sniping at Reagan. During the first half of his career, the GOP establishment didn't have much use for him either. That is, until he dragged them kicking and screaming to seismic political victories that reshaped the contours of U.S. policy. In the 1970s, the other major GOP players, especially Easterners and moderates, thought Reagan was a certified yahoo, recalls Reagan historian Craig Shirley. To a person, by the time of Reagan's death in 2004, they would profess their love and devotion to Reagan and claim they were there from the beginning in 1974, which was a load of horse manure. The political wise men, on both sides of the aisle, had spent years dismissing Reagan as a simpleton. Henry Kissinger once told President Richard Nixon that even though Reagan was a pretty decent guy, his brains are negligible. Clark Clifford, advisor to 4 Democratic presidents and Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Defense, infamously labeled Reagan an amiable dunce. History got the last laugh. End quote. So, talking a little bit about Reagan there, and she mentions that the libertarians were not particularly happy. She says basically, like, everybody tries to claim Reagan. The libertarians have their Reagan quotes that they like to pull up, and the populists have their quotes that they like to pull up, because Reagan was able to kind of combine different ideas into his communication strategy. Everybody wants to claim, oh, I'm a Reagan conservative, or we're all about, Reagan is like the hero of conservatism. But at the time, there were a lot of people on the right who were libertarians or of the establishment who were criticizing him, and they were criticizing him. She talks about the libertarians and says that the libertarians were essentially criticizing Reagan for being a protectionist, that according to the Cato Institute, that he was the most protectionist president since Herbert Hoover, who, by the way, gets a real raw deal when people try to blame the Depression on Hoover, but I'm not going to get into that in this episode. But he had imposed some tariffs on Japanese electronics and motorcycles to protect American electronics, American manufacturers, and Harley-Davidson. Of course, we gave up on those tariffs, and we've largely given up on American consumer electronics. You'd be hard-pressed to go to a store and find any kind of electronic device that is made in America. That's become a very rare thing. But Reagan, back in the 80s, that hadn't completely happened yet, and Reagan was putting up tariffs in place, significant tariffs, to protect American electronics industries and keep us from being completely driven out of business by the Japanese. So the libertarians weren't particularly happy with that. In the end, I think it was the right move. She knocks libertarians a little bit there, but she does mention those 3 terms that I had said previously as protectionist, isolationist, and nativist, which are used against paleoconservatives or populists. Those 3 words, protectionist, isolationist, and nativist, really correspond to the 3 points of Buchanan, the non-intervention, international non-intervention, and non-participation or limited participation in these overreaching global bureaucracies, as well as military non-intervention. The second being protectionism, which really aligns with putting tariffs and various trade barriers in place to protect American industries, and that's what she's talking about here. And then nativist, which is really the position on the border and on immigration of having really strict border controls, limiting illegal immigration and especially illegal immigration, and having comprehensive deportation policies, recognizing the damage to civilization the unreversible damage to civilization that comes about from exceedingly permissive immigration policies. And so those same three things that are used as insults against populists could be used as insults against paleo-conservatives. So for this reason, I really feel like the populist and the paleo-conservative are, very similar or the same, at least on the conservative side of things. And I often identify paleo-conservatism with nationalism as well. She doesn't talk as much in here about the premise of nationalists and nationalism, but definitely talks about conservative populism, which probably isn't all that different. So let me just keep on moving right along here. So she talks about Bush Sr. Bush Sr. only served one term as president from, the election of '88 he was elected, and then the election of '92 was when Clinton was elected, and he was put into office in January of '93. So that was the extent of Bush Sr.'s time in office. And she talks a little bit about Bush Sr.'s re-election campaign. And what happened at that time was that Pat Buchanan tried to primary Bush Sr., who was the sitting president for the '92 presidential campaign, which was an effort that was probably largely doomed from the get-go, but he did okay at it. But ultimately, Bush won the primary, unsurprisingly. He was the sitting president and went on to be challenged by, I should say, Bill Clinton for the nomination. But I'll get into that in a moment. I want to talk about this part here when she's talking about Pat Buchanan's challenge to Bush Sr. Bush Sr. really was he was the guy who, talked about the New World Order. He was really a globalist and establishment. He was Reagan's vice president, but really turned on all of the Reagan loyalists when he took office and steered the country back toward establishment, globalist republicanism, and was kind of hostile to the whole populist side of the party. And for that reason, that was why Buchanan primaried him. And in this section, I'm going to read... There's a significant part here where she quotes from Buchanan's a speech that Buchanan gave, and so when I get to that, I'll just let you know by telling you I'm going to give inner quotes for that section, and then the quote is just going to be the part when I'm reading from the book. So here she says, quote, "Conservatives and populists were frustrated by a Bush regime that in no way resembled the leadership they had been led to believe would be a continuation of Reagan. The violation of the tax pledge was just one of many decisions that angered the populists. Bush's actions on trade, his inability to connect with working Americans, and his patrician demeanor made the old Reagan coalition restless. Enter Reagan speechwriter and conservative stalwart Pat Buchanan. I consider Pat a good friend, and a man who has spent much of his career trying to keep Reagan's populist vision front and center in the GOP. The first time I met Pat Buchanan was in late March of 1982, when other college kids were going to Florida for spring break. We Dartmouth Review writers were making our pilgrimage to the Buchanan beachhead of populist conservatism. Review editor Dinesh D'Souza, publisher Keeney Jones, and I, a freshman reporter who happened to be dating the editor, drove 10 hours from New Hampshire to interview Buchanan at his McLean, Virginia home. Buchanan was a member of our advisory board and stuck with us even during the most explosive controversies. We immediately clicked. As an 18-year-old who was just beginning to understand the intolerance of the left at Dartmouth, I was drawn to Buchanan's pugnacious yet highly intellectual brand of nationalistic conservatism, and loved reading his syndicated column. The way he skewered the National Press Corps for its bias and intellectual snobbery was priceless. His take-no-prisoners approach was the same one we took at the Review toward the liberal tools on campus. Looking at all the political memorabilia Buchanan and his wife Shelley had on their shelves, framed photos of Nixon, Reagan, Confederate Army pistols, awards, I was totally hooked. How exciting it would be, I thought, to have a career like his, to be in the national political fight every day. Embarrassing revelation? At this Buchanan meeting, I wore a corduroy skirt with whales on it, knee socks, and a blue blazer. Tragic. It's a wonder the man ever spoke to me again. As far back as his days working in the Nixon administration, Pat had witnessed the slow fusion of Democrat and Republican parties into a singular ruling elite, a political class who sought, above all else, to maintain its own power. Following Reagan's example from 1976, Buchanan decided to mount a primary run against an incumbent Republican president. Pat Buchanan would do so with an even more populist, nationalistic platform than Reagan, and he also was a well-established national figure in government, television, and print. In those days, he was, in effect, a political reality star. With the Cold War won, Buchanan believed it was time to focus on the home front. He made his announcement on December 10, 1991, from the New Hampshire state capitol. At the time, I was 7 months out of law school, living in New Haven, Connecticut, and clerking for federal appellate court judge Ralph Winter. I caught the replay at night on C-SPAN. Buchanan was on fire. Inner quote, "We must not trade in our sovereignty for a cushioned seat at the head table of anyone's New World Order. The first challenge we face then is economic, presented by the rise of a European superstate and a dynamic Asia led by Japan. The 20th century was the American century, but they intend to make the 21st the century of Europe or the century of Asia. So, as we Americans congratulate one another on the victory for freedom that we, first and foremost, won, and won together for all mankind in the Cold War, we must begin to prepare for the new struggles already underway. All the institutions of the Cold War, from vast permanent U.S. armies on foreign soil, to old alliances against communist enemies that no longer exist, to billions in foreign aid, must be re-examined. With a $4 trillion debt, with the U.S. budget chronically out of balance, should the United States be required to carry indefinitely the burden of defending rich and prosperous allies who take America's generosity for granted as they invade our markets? It is time to end these routinized annual transfers of our national wealth to global bureaucrats who ship it off to regimes that pay us back in compound ingratitude. It is time to phase out foreign aid and start looking out for the needs of the forgotten Americans right here in the United States. So today, we call for a new patriotism, where Americans begin to put the needs of Americans first, for a new nationalism, where in every negotiation, be it arms control or trade, the American side seeks advantage and victory for the United States. The people of this country need to recapture our capital city from an occupying army of lobbyists and registered agents of foreign powers, hired to look out for everybody and everything except the national interest of the United States." And inner quote. On that day, Buchanan, in essence, delivered a better, loftier version of Trump's America First speech. Of course, he was realistic. He knew his odds of victory were slim. Still, he wanted to help conservatives send a signal to the GOP establishment that Bush's globalist designs for a new world order stood in contradiction to the tenets of Reaganism. "President Bush wants to be president of the world," said Buchanan. "I want to be president of the United States." End quote. All right, so that was a cool section there because there's a nice, fairly long part where she's quoting Pat Buchanan's speech in New Hampshire when he declared his candidacy for president in 1991. And he's taking a real America First approach. He's critical. He says basically that everything from the Cold War needs to be re-examined, from all of the military bases on foreign soil, these permanent U.S. armies on foreign soil, old alliances against communist enemies that no longer exist. That's probably pretty clearly a reference to NATO, and billions in foreign aid, that all this stuff must be re-examined. And he's talking about how he says a $4 trillion debt. Our debt is a lot more than $4 trillion now. And yet, all of these things still exist. So the Soviet Union collapsed in 91, and now we're 30 plus years later, and we still have all of our Cold War institutions left over, that we haven't dismantled them. We haven't brought our troops home from these overseas bases. We just keep expanding our global footprint, and it hasn't proven beneficial to us. There are many ways it's proven detrimental. We're so far in debt, we keep paying money in foreign aid, and we keep paying money to these international organizations that we're footing the bill. We're basically funding, more or less, the defense of Europe, so that Europeans don't have to spend an awful lot of money on their militaries. They have kind of subpar militaries, so that we have to protect Europe from Russia because they can't do it themselves, as if Europe is some kind of third world area that needs our protection. But the Europeans are wealthy. There's no reason that the Europeans can't protect themselves. They're not children. The Europeans are perfectly capable of having strong militaries to protect themselves from Russia or from anybody else. But as long as we keep doing it, why would they want to? They'd much rather take that money and spend it on this expansive healthcare programs and college for all their citizens, and all of their citizens talk bad about how Americans don't provide healthcare, and we don't provide this and we don't provide that. Meanwhile, Europeans live under the protection of American military paid for by American taxpayers. And that's a situation that needs to end. And Pat Buchanan saw this immediately in 1991. As soon as the Cold War ended, he saw, okay, we have to reevaluate everything. And we have reevaluated nothing since then. But he's very much speaking about America first. And, it's a constant battle within the Republican Party between the America First faction, the populist faction, the nationalist faction, the paleoconservative faction, however you want to describe it, and the establishment neocons, who want to have essentially a global empire. They're very enthusiastic about being the sole superpower of the world, which is peculiar considering many of their policies have had the direct effect of elevating the position of China to a point where it now threatens us competes with us on the world stage for that position of top dog, which we have now, but how long can we keep it? And do we want to, put forward whatever money and effort and human lives are necessary to maintain that? So these are the sort of things that need to be questioned, and Pat Buchanan was right about it right from the get-go, which is why I'm such a fan of Pat Buchanan. And Laura Ingraham is right on board with Buchanan, which is why I like Laura Ingraham. So, anyway, moving forward from there, obviously Buchanan lost that campaign. So she jumps forward to talk about the general campaign. This is after Bush has secured the nomination, and now Bush is running for president against Bill Clinton, and also Ross Perot. And so she talks a little bit about Ross Perot and the that 92 campaign. She says, quote, President Bush took on Bill Slick Willie Clinton and a moderate Republican billionaire populist by the name of Ross Perot, one of the most eccentric figures ever to enter American presidential politics, and in retrospect, a harbinger, not only of the rising populist movement, but the kind of candidate they ultimately preferred. Perot was short, quirky, had large ears and a squeaky voice, was pro-choice on abortion, and supported gun control. Perot's own campaign manager, Ed Rollins, later said, Perot is insecurity incarnate, and that he would have been a disaster in the White House. Ouch. So, how in the world did a political novice like Ross Perot manage to win an impressive 19% of the popular vote and over 25% in 9 states? Like Buchanan, Perot tapped into the vexation, roiling the country, and economic anger that stunned President Bush the first time he saw it firsthand. The Bush campaign ran a series of taped focus groups with suburban voters who had voted for Bush in 1988 and then showed the president the sessions during a weekend at Camp David. President Bush was shocked by what he saw. "He doesn't get it," said one person. "Doesn't care," said another. "Out of touch. Doesn't have a clue." Another stinger, "More interested in foreigners than America." Perot harnessed that economic outrage and honed in on the insanity of American leaders brokering trade agreements wherein we get our pockets picked and ship American jobs south of the border. "We own this country. It belongs to us," Perot said in his March 1992 speech at the National Press Club. "Government should come from us. We have abdicated our ownership responsibility. You've got to send them a message. You work for us. We don't work for you. Under the constitutions, you are our servants. We've got to put the country back in the control of the owners. And in plain Texas talk, it's time to take out the trash and clean out the barn, or it's going to be too late." Perot then attacked a forthcoming trade treaty that President George H.W. Bush had worked hard to advance, something called the North American Free Trade Agreement. This was another popular theme he co-opted from Buchanan. Interquote, "The White House is all excited about the new trade agreement with Mexico. This agreement will move the highest paid blue-collar jobs in the United States to Mexico. This is going to create serious damage to our tax base during this critical period. We have got to manufacture here and not there to keep our tax base intact." End interquote. He may have been a kooky billionaire, but on NAFTA, Perot was a prophetic kooky billionaire. NAFTA, of course, is the trade agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, negotiated by George H.W. Bush and signed into law by Bill Clinton on December 8, 1993. A majority of Republicans supported it. Clinton strongly embraced it and lobbied Democrats hard to overcome objections from many in his party and its labor union base. NAFTA supporters like Clinton promised the trade deal would benefit Americans economically by removing tariffs, accelerating trade, boosting exports to Mexico, and generating U.S. jobs. 1 million in the first 5 years, Clinton promised. Populists like Pat Buchanan warned NAFTA would create dozens of new bureaucracies, diminish U.S. sovereignty, mandate billions in foreign aid and loan guarantees, create reams of regulations, and ship hundreds of thousands of U.S. jobs and businesses to Mexico in pursuit of cheaper labor and bigger profits. With Buchanan out of the race, Perot picked up the populist mantle and opposed NAFTA in memorable fashion. In October, during the second presidential debate between all three candidates, Perot hammered the folly of one-way trade agreements, said we have got to stop sending jobs overseas, and dropped his famous line. Interquote, "To those of you in the audience who are business people, pretty simple. If you're paying $12, $13, $14 an hour for factory workers, and you can move your factory south of the border, pay $1 an hour for your labor, have no health care, that's the most expensive single element in making a car, have no environmental controls, no pollution controls, no retirement, and you don't care about anything but making money, there will be a giant sucking sound going south." End interquote. A giant sucking sound. Perot hit rhetorical pay dirt. NAFTA wasn't signed into law yet, but Perot and millions of Americans, the kind who don't worship at the Wall Street Journal's altar of globalism and internationalism for profit's sake, knew it was a raw deal for workers and bad for America. The biggest tell that NAFTA was going to be a boon for elites and a bust for everyone else was the fact that George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, as well as all their donor-class pals, supported the monstrosity. Ross Perot ran a disorganized and zany campaign, but the same working-class disgust with the political class that fueled Buchanan's run coalesced into Perot winning nearly 1 out of every 5 votes. In the 4 years since Ronald Reagan's presidency, people realized no one was looking out for them any longer. Read my lips, no new taxes, the condescending elitism, a lopsided focus on international relationships to create a new world order, a looming NAFTA deal to cede even more American sovereignty and ship away even more American jobs. The people had finally had enough. End quote. So there you see, we get to look a little bit at Ross Perot. I am a fan of Ross Perot. I think we would have been in much better shape had Ross Perot won in 1992 instead of Bill Clinton. I think we really needed Ross Perot. He was prophetic. He knew what was going to happen, just like Buchanan has been prophetic about these sorts of things. And I think that, Ross Perot would have just been a great deal for this country to get some of that populist movement. I mean, he wasn't really, she says he was pro-choice, he was pro-gun control, he wasn't necessarily a conservative, like a diehard conservative by any stretch. He was a Republican, I guess, before he decided to run on the Reform Party ticket. But nonetheless, that for him to go into office at that time, unlikely as it clearly was, would have, I think, been we would have had a much better result in how we transitioned our country post-Cold War. So, with that said, there's Ross Perot. And then, let's see, a little bit more about Clinton that I want to look at. When she's talking here about Clinton and China. And this is a bit of a longer section as well. So in this section, she says, quote, "In October 1997, I traveled to California near the U.S.-Mexican border to report on a Clinton effort to curb illegal immigration. Operation Gatekeeper was implemented in 1994 with bipartisan support under the direction of Clinton Attorney General Janet Reno. It included the construction of a 5.5-mile long double border fence from the Pacific Ocean eastward. Congress also added money to double the number of Border Patrol agents and improve biometric scanning to detect repeat offenders and criminals at weak spots along the border. Newsflash, the fencing worked. It choked off the entry point for thousands of lawbreakers, although critics note that it merely pushed the illegal crossings eastward. Driving on the dusty border road with the chief officer from U.S. Border Patrol, Chief Johnny Williams, I heard his story about the old days, pre-Gatekeeper, when illegal immigrants would swarm right past the San Ysidro checkpoint and into the United States. California Governor Pete Wilson, who himself had taken a bold and popular stand against the explosion of illegal immigration, told me a federal focus on securing the southern border was long overdue. Proposition 187 to ban illegal aliens from using social services, Proposition 209 to prevent racial preferences in state hiring, and Proposition 227 to ensure English education in schools. The people were with him, but the elites labeled the measures racist. Yet whatever populist inclination Bill Clinton had toward immigration enforcement was diluted by the economic punch he delivered to the nation's gut during his second term. Indeed, he saved the best or worst for last. If NAFTA had unleashed a flood of dangerous economic currents crashing into the American working class, his decision to pave the way for China's entry into the World Trade Organization, WTO, by giving it permanent normal trade relations, PNTR, now known as Most Favored Nation status, swelled into an outsourcing tidal wave that washed millions of American manufacturing jobs out to sea, the South China Sea, that is. Like any good elitist, Bill Clinton heralded loudest the policies that hurt regular working people the most. In My Life, Clinton says he believes that clearing the way for China's entry into the WTO would prove to be one of the most important foreign policy developments of my 8 years. Technically, that is a true statement. It is one of the most important foreign policy developments if you want to understand the destruction of American manufacturing. It is also one of the most important foreign policy developments for understanding how millions of U.S. manufacturing jobs were vaporized in record speed, even as China grew at a steroidal rate of muscular economic growth. Let's start with the basics. The World Trade Organization was officially created during Bill Clinton's presidency in January 1995, but it had existed in other forms since 1948. On paper, the WTO claims its purpose is to act as a sort of trade referee between its 164 member nations. The WTO is supposed to help countries hammer out trade agreements, iron out legal contracts between nations seeking to buy and sell things to each other, and resolve disputes. So-called most favored nation status means all WTO members agree to treat each other equally. If you lower tariffs for one country, you agree to extend the same tariff cut to all the other WTO members, as if they are all a most favored trading partner. Clinton sold the China trade deal just as he sold NAFTA. He enlisted an all-star cast of globalist elites to help get the China trade deal through Congress, including Presidents Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, President George H.W. Bush's globalist alter ego James Baker, and President Nixon's brain trust Henry Kissinger. In total, Clinton's behind-the-scenes jawboning resulted in over 100 face-to-face or group meetings with members of Congress and dozens more over the phone. He made sweeping promises, more grand than those he had made with NAFTA. Economically, this agreement is the equivalent of a one-way street, Clinton promised on March 8, 2000. It requires China to open its markets, with a fifth of the world's population, potentially the biggest markets in the world, to both our products and services in unprecedented new ways. All we do is agree to maintain the present access, which China enjoys. It would be an economic dream come true, Clinton vowed. We'll be able to export products without exporting jobs. We do nothing, President Clinton said bluntly. We take and the Chinese give, he explained. They have to lower tariffs. They open up telecommunications for investment. They allow us to sell cars made in America and China at much lower tariffs. They allow us to put up our own distributions over there. They allow us to put up our own parts over there. He then doubled down on how beautiful and glorious America's new world order would be. This is a 100-0 deal for America when it comes to the economic consequences. All of Washington's usual poker players anteed up and played their strongest hands. Deep-pocketed establishment forces, like the United States Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable, dropped their biggest ever campaign for a bill at the time with a $10 million ad blitz. Peanuts in comparison to the cash multinational corporations stood to gain in the form of outsourcing high-wage American jobs and gaining greater access to cheap Chinese labor and over 1 billion potential customers. Big labor pushed back. This is a betrayal of workers' interests, said the then president of the United Steelworkers of America, George Becker. This is about moving factories from the U.S. so they can export back here. Meanwhile, libertarians over at the Cato Institute were busy being, well, libertarians, rambling on about theoretical mumbo-jumbo while looking down their noses at the dum-dums who just didn't get the need to worship trade agreements. It is primarily U.S. exporters who will benefit, declared Cato Institute senior fellow Doug Bando. Furthermore, he said, the silliest arguments against giving China permanent most favored nation status is that Chinese imports would overwhelm U.S. industry. Most favored nation status for China would create far more export opportunities for American than Chinese concerns, the libertarian scholar explained. If we vote for this 10 years from now, we will wonder why it was a hard fight, Clinton said. And if the Congress votes against it, they'll be kicking themselves in the rear 10 years from now because America will be paying the price. Clinton's China trade campaign worked. On May 25, 2000, the Congress voted 237 to 197 to give China permanent most favored nation status. Clinton's cheerleaders at the New York Times heralded the vote as a stunning victory and said the president considered it a crowning foreign policy triumph. Clinton took his victory lap using words that send a shiver up the spine today. "This is a good day for America. In 10 years from now, we will look back on this day and be glad we did this," said Clinton. "We will see that we have given ourselves a chance to build the kind of future we want." 17 years hence, it is difficult to overstate the economic destruction wrought by China's entry into the WTO and Congress and President Clinton's decision to grant the Chinese permanent most favored nation status. A 2016 analysis, published in the Annual Review of Economics, concluded that between 1999 and 2011, America lost between 2 and 2.4 million jobs. Others, like the left-leaning Economic Policy Institute, put the American job loss figures even higher at 3.2 million jobs when calculated between the years 2001 and 2013. The brutal economic reality was a cruel reversal of Clinton's promises. All the gains were on the Chinese side. All the losses and devastation were America's. American manufacturing jobs were eviscerated. From 2001 to 2011, U.S. manufacturing jobs plunged from 17.1 million to 11.8 million. That's a loss of 5.3 million manufacturing jobs, a figure that's nearly the population of the entire state of Minnesota. The narrowing of the trade deficit between the United States and China never materialized either. To the contrary, it exploded. In 2000, the annual trade in goods deficit with China stood at a towering $84 billion. After Clinton ushered China to the front of the line, the trade deficit more than quadrupled to a jaw-dropping $367 billion by 2015. The year before America let China join the WTO, 1999, the United States accounted for 25.78% of world GDP. By 2014, that figure had dropped to 22.43%, the lowest it has been in government records going back to 1969, according to the Economic Research Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. In 1999, China's annual GDP was $1.094 trillion. In 2015, it was more than $11 trillion. In 1999, the U.S. national debt was $5.7 trillion, the good old days. Today, after the big government globalist policies of the last several presidents, U.S. national debt stands at a mind-bending $20 trillion. End quote. So that whole section is about, I know that was a little long, that whole section is about the World Trade Organization and Bill Clinton's opening up of our trade to China. She talks a little bit in the beginning about the border, and I just brought that in to indicate that this is during Bill Clinton's second term, and he had sort of what he called triangulation, which was really just him moving more to the center, because when he first got into office, I guess he was really, pushing a lot of progressive policies, and with Hillary Clinton's healthcare initiative and whatnot, and it didn't go well. His numbers, his ratings, his poll numbers just plummeted, and so then he started his triangulation. He's basically tried to walk back a bunch of his progressive initiatives and tried to move a little bit to the center again. And in his second term, it's often considered that he was more of a centrist president. And so he had an initiative on the border called Operation Gatekeeper. Apparently it had some impact, although I'm not so sure that it had all that much impact, truthfully. But she says that whatever he had done for immigration, whatever kind of populist instincts he might have had on the border, was completely overshadowed by his campaigning to bring China into the World Trade Organization and give them what's called most favored nation status. And so that just basically annihilated our ability to put up any sort of protection against importing Chinese products. And these initiatives, NAFTA and bringing China on board and basically eliminating our ability to put up tariffs to prevent Chinese imports, just sent huge amounts of manufacturing to China where labor costs were so low and their regulations were so slim. Their environmental regulations are virtually non-existent, and especially a couple of decades ago when this first happened, we just started importing everything from China. You go to the store and you look at everything is made in China everywhere. And this is why, because we had said, well, we're not going to put up barriers to trade to counterbalance the differential in wages. We're just not going to do that. And so it became so much easier for manufacturers and for companies to build manufacturing facilities overseas. Even an American company would either build a factory overseas or would just hire some Chinese factory to make the products for them, and we lost 5.3 million manufacturing jobs, and that's over the course of only 10 years, from 2001 to 2011. 5.3 million manufacturing jobs lost in 10 years after that was passed, and the trade deficit, so the difference between how much stuff we buy from them and how much stuff we sell them, our trade deficit is just like the surplus of amount of stuff that we're buying from them versus what we're exporting, quadrupled to from 84 billion, which was already pretty significant, to 367 billion. That's not the total of trade, that's just the trade deficit. $367 billion more of stuff that we're bringing in versus what we're sending them. So what do they get in exchange for all of this stuff that they're sending us when we're not sending adequate stuff to them? Cash. And what do they do with that cash? They can't use it in their own economy. They buy American treasury bonds, which finances American debt, the debt of our national debt. They buy property, American properties. They buy American businesses. It's a horrible situation, and our national debt. She also talks about the expansion of the national debt, although that's different. It's not completely unrelated. So that was just more of a catastrophic. And now China is so much. I mean, they benefited from that so much. They were able to set up so many factories and get technological capacity by us providing them with the tools and the knowledge to be able to build the things that we wanted to build. We enhanced their industrial capabilities. We made them a lot of money. And now, they are in a position to threaten us in a way that decades ago they really were not. So it was just catastrophic. It was catastrophic. So that's all about that. Then there's one more brief section. This is not very long. Those have been a few long sections there. This is pretty short, and it's just a little bit. I'm going to skip over George W. Bush and Obama when she talks about those guys and jump in here to just a brief little section about the Trump campaign when she says the following. Quote, days before the Iowa caucuses, National Review dropped its now infamous Against Trump cover issue. National Review editor Rich Lowry rounded up 22 conservatives to write essays in an effort to take down the menace to American conservatism, Donald Trump. The move was roundly castigated by conservatives and was a public relations disaster whose damage only grew after Donald Trump's historic victory. That some of the signatories were my friends made it all the more disappointing. The list included people like Bill Kristol, Glenn Beck, Eric Erickson, Brent Bozell, Dana Lash, Michael Medved, Katie Pavlich, John Podhoretz, Thomas Sowell, and Cal Thomas. This wasn't the first time National Review tried to excommunicate conservatives. In 2003, they launched a similar effort in a cover story called Unpatriotic Conservatives. Back then, they were gunning for Pat Buchanan and the late Bob Novak. They're Davos conservatives, Pat Buchanan said on my show, referencing the annual meeting of the globalist elite in Switzerland. The late matriarch of the conservative movement and one of my personal heroines, Phyllis Schlafly, put it this way to me on my show. I'm not going to tell you that Donald Trump is perfect or right on everything, but immigration is the top issue today, and he's the only one who made it a front-burner issue. Furthermore, noted Schlafly, National Review is not the authentic conservative voice. I don't recognize National Review as the authority on conservatism. As evidence, she referenced NR founder William F. Buckley's support for giving away the Panama Canal, the axial issue Ronald Reagan ran against in his famous primary battle with President Ford. Former Governor Mike Huckabee called it a foolhardy errand on the part of the National Review, and cast the stunt as yet another example of elitists who live in their own little bubble and think they represent rank and file. Among National Review's beefs with Trump, he is not deserving of conservative support in the caucuses and primaries. Trump is a philosophically unmoored conservative opportunist who would rather trash the broad conservative ideological consensus within the GOP in favor of a free-floating populism with strongman overtones. The National Review editors further explained that Donald Trump is a menace to American conservatism who would take the work of generations and trample it underfoot in behalf of a populism as heedless and crude as the Donald himself. How dramatic. Progressive reporters and media outlets ate it up, splashing the garish Against Trump purple NR cover everywhere. Establishment media hoped that giving the Against Trump cover story outsized attention and oxygen might spark a conservative mutiny before voters headed to the polls. The real tragedy, from my vantage point, was the fact that by maintaining a country club-like air of exclusivity toward Trump's working class and populist supporters, National Review created the impression that the tenets of Bushism had become an orthodoxy conservatives weren't allowed to question. As I wrote in my column at the time, who really is the menace? The rough-edged Queens native? Or the smooth-talking GOP establishment that has brought us open borders, massive giveaway trade deals, monstrous debt, bank bailouts, and a sprawling government that never stops expanding? End quote. So that section I just wanted to read because I think that was just such a colossal strategic blunder on the part of National Review and on the part of Rich Lowry, who was the editor of National Review at the time. I like National Review. I read it from time to time. I mostly listen to the podcast, the editor's podcast, which is pretty good. Give it a listen. Some of those guys are more vehemently anti-Trump than others, but it just seems like a real stupid mistake for them to devote so much of their issue, so much of an issue to attacking the leading presidential contender for the nomination, the leading Republican contender for the nomination. And then, he went on and win the primary. And what are you going to do at that point? I'm pretty sure that they ultimately backed Trump over Hillary. But at that point, you really got egg on your face. It's one thing for them to say, well, we support Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz was Donald Trump's main contender at that time. In that primary race, and it would have been one thing for them to say, we support Ted Cruz, we're endorsing Ted Cruz for the following reasons, and had people come on board and they could write articles expressing their support for Ted Cruz. But for National Review, with the amount of weight that it carries in the conservative movement, to turn and attack the front runner of their own party just seems like a real blunder. To generate a lot of ill will between National Review and all of the many people, such as myself, who supported Donald Trump. That doesn't seem like a smart move at all. And I think that they got a little big for their britches. I think in the past, the whole thing with William F. Buckley kind of kicking the John Birch Society out of conservatism, as they like to frame it. It went to their head, and they started thinking that they had, the authority to say who is and who isn't welcome in the Republican Party. And especially now with the rise of social media and the internet and blogs and all of the websites and all of the talk radio and everything else, National Review is just one voice among many, and they don't have the authority that they may have had in the 1960s as like the premier conservative magazine. Those days are gone, and they don't have the trend-setting power that they used to have. And I think they really made a blunder by trying to exercise some degree of control over the conservative conversation that they really didn't have the capacity to exercise. But everybody makes mistakes, and I still consider myself a National Review fan. Hopefully they learned their lesson from that, and that's all I'm gonna say about this book. I think it's cool, and I think it's important to recognize that Jeff Flake's vision, that he's got his vision of what conservatism is. I don't begrudge him that. Everybody has their vision. Laura Ingraham has her vision, and I think it's important that, nobody should be really positioning themselves as some sort of authority. Like Flake would be like, this is what conservatism is, and all these other people are wrong about what conservatism is. Conservatism is what the people make of it. It's what the voters make of it. And nobody has the kind of authority to lay down the law of what conservatism is or isn't. The more you try to do that, the more obsolete you make yourself, because nobody, people aren't just sheep that can be led by, the shepherds of the party. It doesn't work like that. And the people define what conservatism is by what they claim it is and what they claim themselves to be, and what they claim for it to mean for themselves to claim to be conservative. They mean something when they say that, and the sort of aggregate of what people mean when they say that is the practical, functional use, the meaning of when people use the term conservative. So I guess a word of warning to Flake or Lowry or anybody else who would try to, put the law down and say this is what it means for whether it's conservatism or anything else. Really, language is, obviously we have dictionaries and words have meanings, but language is always evolving. And especially now with the internet and the amount of communication that people engage in on the regular, language evolves quickly. So you have to be able to roll with the punches, or you have to be able to go with the flow a little bit, which is to say that, everybody shouldn't be able to say, this is what I believe. But to try to pinpoint definitions of this is what conservatism is a little bit different than saying, well, this is what I believe, this is what I care about, this is how I think things should be. To say this is conservatism and that is not conservatism. It's just to assert an authority over language that nobody really has. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.